Years ago now, there was a comedian by the name of Jack Benny. I'm curious how many of you remember Jack Benny? Yeah, I've read about him. One day, many years ago, he did a skit and an armed robber came behind him and said, "Your money or your life?" Benny hesitated, didn't say anything for what seemed like an eternity. He said, "Okay, what will it be?" To which Benny responded, "Don't rush me. I'm thinking about it." He got it. Your money, my money, really represents a huge, important part of our lives. It just does. And guess what? Jesus knew this. In fact, did you know that over half the stories that Jesus ever told, they're in the Bible, in the New Testament, called parables, are about the management of this one single issue in our lives? Now, why in the world would the Savior of the world spend so much time and effort and energy talking to his disciples, to those who were following after him, about this single subject matter? Great question. And I'll tell you why. Because this issue impacts everything. It impacts your present, it impacts your future, and today, as we will soon discover, it actually has eternal implications. Good morning, West Cobb Church. What a glorious, beautiful, crisp fall day the Lord has given us on Fall Back Sunday. I'm quite sure that although you're supposed to get an extra hour of sleep, not many of you really did. And by the way, can we give it up for our worship team? That was phenomenal this morning. They do such an incredible job. If you're just joining us, welcome. My name is Stan, and I'm privileged to be one of the pastors here. And we've been in this series of conversations called Satisfied, where we're sort of drilling down, we're asking and trying to answer a question. How do you discover contentment in a world of consumption? Or maybe another way to say it in Metro Atlanta, another way to talk about it, and we mentioned this last time, is how do we discover satisfaction when it comes to all of our stuff? Because let's face it, we're talking about in this conversation about our money, our finances, we're talking about our stuff, our possessions, but here's the deal. We're doing it from God's perspective, not from the world's perspective. We're not talking about what does Madison Avenue say, what does Wall Street say, what does Hollywood say. We're saying, what does God say? And I know even that conversation alone can scare some of us, because to be honest, we've had a lot of bad teaching and bad examples when it comes to money in a lot of churches, even churches that I've been a part of. I remember a certain pastor said, you know, if you don't give X amount of dollars, you're wearing God's clothes, you're driving God's car, you're living in God's house. I'm thinking, oh. I remember hearing about a pastor that said, you know, we're going to receive an offering because God told me to buy a $60 million jet. And so we're going to pass the basket until that much money is raised. I'm thinking, oh, okay. And there's even a pastor who said, I want everyone to stand up. I want you to give your wallet to your neighbor, and then I want you to give like you've always wanted to give. See, that could even happen, right? And I bring that up because you don't have to have any fear about what God says. In fact, this could be actually liberating, because there's a big idea that we're talking about in this conversation, and it's found in your listening guide if you have one. God he actually longs for you, he longs for me to be satisfied, to be content, to be full of pleasure. We're his children. In fact, not only does he long for it, as we said last time, he commands it. However, in order for us to gain true satisfaction, we're going to have to sort of move ourselves in our thinking and our paradigm from the way we've been taught growing up in America, this consumer-oriented, entitled conversation that we have in Cobb County and Paulding County and in Metro Atlanta and America, so that we can discover what it is that God is really trying to say through his word to us today. Now today we're talking about generosity and investing, and we're talking about money and our finances, and we could easily talk about the privilege of giving or the responsibility to give. We're not going to go there, although I could easily make a case if you're a follower of Jesus, that's easy to talk about. Today, the emphasis is going to be more on the sheer joy and the satisfaction and the freedom that we can experience when we view our money from God's perspective. We could actually gain some sound wisdom and advice when it comes to finances, to our stuff, to investing in the future, making wise long-term investments. little over a month ago when I broached the subject matter with our team, our creative team. I said, I got so much to say, about budgeting and giving and investing and making a difference and generosity and our stuff. I just don't have time in 3 weeks to do it. So the reality is there's some good news and some bad news. And I often say, which one do you want first? But for me, I just want to get the bad news over with. So here goes. The richest man, according to the Bible and history, the world has ever known was a guy named Solomon, King Solomon. We talked about him last time. Some of you who remember who Jack Benny was, you maybe remember there was a TV show called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. It talked about, I think, champagne dreams and caviar wishes, or was it caviar wishes and champagne dreams? Either way, it had to do with some fish eggs and some fruit juice. That's what I remember. And you talk about champagne and caviar and mega wealth. Just according to history, the gold and silver alone that were in the holdings of King Solomon would make Bill Gates and Warren Buffett's combined treasure look like paupers and peasants. He had this huge palace. The great celebrities of the day hung out in his crib. And yet here's what Solomon, and all of his wealth and all of his wisdom and all of his popularity and all of his sentiment, here is what he actually discovered. Ecclesiastes 5:10 says, whoever loves money, what is it? It never has money enough. Oh man. Whoever loves wealth, and here's the word, is never what? Satisfied. Say it with me. Satisfied with his income. Now sadly, I see me and I see Metro Atlanta in this. That if I had more, I'd be satisfied. If I made more money, I'd be more satisfied. If I made more money, I'd be more content. If I made more money, I'd feel more secure. Hey, you're more like Big Lips Mick Jagger than we want to play like we are, because I can't get no satisfaction that way. But it's not just me. People that know us know my wife as well, okay? And she has a flair for decorating and redecorating and redecorating on a dime. Because when you plant a church with no money and 8 people and you grow it however God grew it, you have to learn to be very efficient and frugal. Okay, she calls me cheap, but that's another conversation. And so over the years, what if I, for example, said, honey, I know we have some raggedy furniture. What if I say, hey, I'm gonna give you 1 hour of unlimited shopping at Haverty's or Rooms to Go. You pick the store. And you can buy any couch, any love seat, any divan, any lamp, any nightstand, any comforter, any pillow, you name it, as much as you want, 1 hour of unlimited shopping. Question, ladies, would that make her happy for the rest of her life? Well, we'll never know, will we? Why? Because what we talked about last time, the myth of more. If I had more of this or if I had more of that, then I'd be more satisfied. And so Solomon continues, as goods increase, so do those who consume them. And in effect, he says, the more you have, the more consumption occurs, the more the government wants. He goes on, and what benefit are they to the owner except to feast his eyes on them? He says, they look good on the outside, the image management and all this stuff, but deep down, they don't serve you all that well. They don't satisfy the deepest longings of your heart and your experience. And then he says, the sleep of a laborer is sweet, whether he eats little or much. But watch this. But the abundance of a rich man permits him no sleep. He says, the more you have to worry about, to get anxious about, to wring your hands, to toss and turn all night long. And then he finishes, I see a grievous evil under the sun. What's the evil that he sees? He says, wealth hoarded to the harm of its owners. Solomon doesn't say to the harm of other people who aren't, benefiting from the wealth. He says the emphasis is on the damage it does to the person who isn't being generous, who is hoarding their wealth. It's harming this person who is not being generous with what God has given them. And then he adds a classic verse, the naked I came, the naked I go. Here's the way he says it. He says, we all come to the end of our lives as naked and empty-handed as on the day we were born. And then the Bible actually says this, we can't take our riches with us. You were born naked and you will leave the same way. And this is why, and I've done hundreds and hundreds of funerals, and I've seen hundreds and hundreds of hearses, and never behind a hearse was there a U-Haul pulling their stuff. You know why? You can't take it with you. Now, throughout these verses, and there are many, many more that I could share with you, what Solomon is doing, and just so you know, he's not saying that money is bad or that wealth is evil. If you missed last week's talk, please do yourself a favor and go online and watch last week's talk on our website. It's an opening primer to our conversation. It's very important. So he's not against you amassing wealth or saving money, but here's what he's saying. Here's what I've learned. Here's my story. And I don't want you to make the same mistake I made, thinking that all of this stuff would give me the satisfaction that I craved and longed for. So that's one of the learnings we get from Solomon. Unlike anyone else in human history, he had everything his heart wanted and more. 700 wives and 300 concubines. Who needs that many? And so he says, with great authority, this can't buy you love, it can't buy you satisfaction. And he said, at the end of the day, I'm so disillusioned by it. And the biggest word, if you did a Google search in Ecclesiastes about it, he uses the word, it became meaningless to me. Wow, meaningless. That's the bad news. I just want you to know that. That's the bad news. Your stuff and your money will never fully and ultimately satisfy you. But now there's some good news. And since I'm a gospel guy, I love the good news. I'm a good news proclaimer of good news. And this is really great news because it not only is a solution to Solomon's dilemma, it's the solution to yours. Along comes a disciple named Matthew. He's a tax collector and his god is money, Mammon, the little g god of Mammon. And yet his trajectory is radically changed by a rabbi named Jesus of Nazareth. So he becomes his disciple and he writes a gospel that bears his name, Matthew. And he tells of a time when Jesus was teaching to a crowd one day. The only man wiser than old King Solomon was Jesus. And here's what Jesus has to say with great wisdom, and I hope you'll lean into the conversation today. And he talks about our money and our stuff, and he uses the word treasures to talk about it. Jesus' words. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but instead store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. And then he adds, oh, by the way, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This is, according to Jesus, the treasure principle. In the remainder of our time together, I want to play out what would the implications be of us following through on what Jesus said and what he really meant. He begins, do not store up for yourselves treasures. Is it because treasures are bad? No, Jesus never says that. Or they're evil? No, not at all. He says it's because they don't last. All the stuff that we have acquired over all the years eventually lands in a landfill. It will either wear out or it will rust out. Stocks will rise and fall. Real estate holdings will come and go. Proverbs says riches sprout wings and fly away. Men and women, the next time students, the next time you're somewhere that you think I absolutely positively have to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on this, I want you to visualize it's sprouting wings and flying away because it will one day. Do you remember what you got last Christmas? See? So over the years, Teresa and I have loved the mountains. We lived near the beach, but we loved the mountains. And so we would a few times travel to Asheville, North Carolina, to a little cottage called the Biltmore House. How many of you have ever been to the Biltmore Estate in Asheville? Yeah. Did you know that it took 1,000 men 6 years to build 180,000 square feet, 250 rooms on 125,000 acres? You thought you had a lot of grass to mow, sir. Okay. Guess what? The gentleman who built this, now he's not even there to enjoy it. People are just taking tours and paying big sums of dollars, which I refuse to pay any longer, so she goes by herself or with our girls, because all they're doing is look at what was. And I want to live in what is and what could be. John D. Rockefeller, his accountant, I'm told he was a very wealthy man. And a journalist asked his accountant, how much money did Rockefeller leave? And the journalist thought about it for a while and he said, you know what? He left it all. Friends, Jesus is telling us, don't store up your treasures on earth, not because it's wrong to do so, but because it doesn't make the best sense and ultimately isn't going to satisfy you in a long-term way. But Jesus isn't done. He not only says, don't store up treasures on earth, he says, rather, and here's his great investment advice, you ought to be storing up, just like he commands you, bless you, he commands you to be satisfied, he commands you to store up treasures instead in heaven. There's a corollary. See, the treasure mentality that Jesus wants us to have is he longs for us to start storing up treasures, but he wants you to stop storing them in the wrong place and start storing them in the right place so that they can make an eternal investment difference. Not because it's smart or because it makes sense, but because it will last, and Jesus wants us to make lasting investments, wise investments. This is one of the most unbelievable beatitudes that in the Bible, and it's the words of Jesus recorded in Acts. Jesus once said, and I want you to answer it for me out loud, it's more blessed to give than to, yeah. Do we really believe that? I mean, all of our intuition and all of our human instincts fly in the face of, it's more better to give than to receive. You mean the giver is happier than the getter? Absolutely. Our great God wants us to do what is not only best for others, not only what's best for him and for his glory, for the sake of the gospel and for the local church, the bride of Christ, but he actually has your best interest in heart. He wants you to be satisfied. Maximum glory to God and maximum satisfaction for you, his child. And so Jesus takes this profound truth and he says, yes, you can't take it with you, but, and look at this, but you can send it on ahead. How do you do that? Jesus says, anything you try to hang on, hoard on, anything on this earth will one day be gone. But anything that we put into God's hands will be multiplied into all of eternity. Anything I put into God's hands will be not only recorded and restored, but also rewarded for all time. West Cobb Church, I began to think about this the last month or so, that if we would personally respond in a joyful generosity, that our families would be blessed, and our neighbors would be blessed, and our churches would be blessed, and it would be kingdom-shaking stuff. Because think about this, each of us were made for a person and made for a place. And Jesus is the person and heaven is the place. And you'll never be satisfied with any person less than Jesus, and you'll never be satisfied with any place less than heaven. So all Jesus is doing is saying, I want you to take your treasures and I want you to store them up into the hands of a person, Jesus, that you were made for, into a place, heaven, that you're going to be in one day. It's incredible investment advice and very wise, and it's known as the treasure principle. Over the years at a church that I pastored, I gave hundreds and hundreds of books away by a man named Randy Alcorn called The Treasure Principle. There's some principles from his book as well as some things that I've learned over time. And our time that remains, I want to kind of give you some keys to the treasure principle. This idea of how joyful generosity brings God maximum glory and gives us maximum satisfaction. Some of these come from this book, and others, I've learned along the way. And many of these are countercultural and counterintuitive to what we have actually been trained to believe, but they have a biblical precedent. If you're taking notes in your listening guide, number one is huge. It is ginormous. If you don't get any of the others, get this. Number one, God owns everything. I'm his money manager. Let that set in for just a moment. I don't own anything. God owns everything. Everything I have is a gift from God. I'm wearing God's clothes. I'm driving God's car. I live in God's house. God's Weimaraner lives in my man cave. God's boat is in my garage right now unused. This is God's body, thank God, right? Okay. All of it is God's, and it's only on loan for a little while. And from the time we're born until the time we die, we choose to decide what we're going to do with everything that God has gifted us. How's that going for you? How are you doing with that one? Well, really, Pastor, God owns everything. The psalmist declares in Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. What does that not cover? Leviticus 25 says, the land is mine and you are but aliens in my tenants. The silver is mine and the gold is mine. What does that not include? God literally owns it all, which also means that God doesn't need anything from you. God doesn't need you to give him anything back. Doesn't need you to. We hear this word all the time, especially in churches. The word is the word stewardship. Really important word. What does it mean to be a steward? A steward, look at this. A steward is someone who manages assets for the owner's benefit. And the chief job of a steward is to find out what the owner wants done with his assets and carry out his will. 1 Corinthians 4 says, it is required of a steward that they are to be found faithful. Did you know that God longs for you to be found faithful in your stewardship of what he owns and what he's gifted you with? He wants to be able to say at the end of the day, well done. And the more faithful you are with the treasures he's given you, the more treasures he's likely to give you. The more talents, the more treasures he's likely to put into your hands. Some of you know that for about 20 years now as a pastor, I've been given the gift by our leadership teams to take 2 to 3 weeks in what's called a study break. I go away to the mountains usually. I decompress because ministry is messy because it includes us. People are messy. And then I get a word from God and I get a sense of where we're going as a church family, and I get some leeway on my message series so our creative team has something to work with when I return. And so this year I had the privilege, 2 people that I know, one of them allowed me to stay. They gave me the key and the code to their beautiful vacation log home in Hiwassee near Lake Chetu. Pretty nice, right? And then a man that I know from South Florida has a 250-acre vineyard and several cottages that are majestically furnished, and he gave me the key and the code as well. So those 3 weeks so what if I did this? What if at the end of my summer break, I said, hey, the mountain views were so stunning, the summertime weather was so refreshing in the mountains, from Atlantic to the mountains. I enjoyed the big cozy bed so well. It was so soft and so incredible. I'm just gonna go ahead and keep the key and the code. This house is now my house. This cottage is now my cottage. How would that go over? You say, well, Pastor, that's ridiculous. Guess what? We do that when we fail to realize that God is the owner and I'm only his manager for a little while, and then it's gonna be over. That's what the Bible teaches. The first key to the treasure principle: God owns everything. I'm his money manager. I'm to be a steward. I'm to be found faithful. Key number 2 to the treasure principle of God gaining maximum glory and us having maximum satisfaction is this: my heart always goes where I put God's money. You don't have to believe me. Jesus said in Matthew 6:21, here it is again, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Christ says, you show me your bank account, you show me your Visa receipts, you show me where you spend your cash, and I'll show you where your heart is. What do your financial records and mine show us about where our heart is going? I'll give you a few examples today. I didn't really care a whole lot about the University of Central Florida until we had to send our middle daughter there and spend a lot of money to get her through 4 years of school. How many of you parents know exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to college and sending off students? Okay, a few of you do. Well, suddenly I cared a whole lot more about UCF. I began to root for the UCF Knights to win in football because my money was going to them, and so therefore my heart was going to them as well. They sort of got my heart. By the way, they've won like 21 games consecutively in a row in football, but they still probably won't be in the college playoffs. It's crazy. Now I don't care as much about UCF because she got her degree and she moved on to Texas, so I'm good to go. My heart's no longer there because my treasure's no longer there. And here's the thing, it's not only true in that regard, but look at this again, this is in your outline. Where we put our money not only shows where our heart is, it determines where our heart is going. Where our heart is going. All I had was like an iPhone and a MacBook, and I didn't care that much about Apple. And then I decided to invest in Apple stock. Guess what? About every day I cared about Apple after that. You know why? Because I had vested interest in the stock. And I wish I wouldn't have sold all that Apple stock. Reminded me today, and this is a true story, all the others not so sure, but the true story, I'm in Northwest Arkansas. I'm a student pastor for 18 years. A buddy of mine's a student pastor. He told me this story. He said that about every month they would do what's called visitation. You knock on a door, but every month he would visit a certain home where there was a student who got messed up on drugs, and he was trying to reach this student and his family. He said about every month when I would visit this family for 6 months, there was an older man who was sitting on an old rusty riding lawnmower on the side of the yard. True story. And as Larry tells me this story, he says, this guy would sit there. And so one day he said, instead of going to knock on the door, I went over to talk to the man. It was the grandfather of the boy. And he had sort of a sour look on his face. He said, sir, what are you doing? I've seen you here like every time I come on this lawnmower. He said, well, this is a $3 million lawnmower. Larry looks at it and goes, excuse me? He said, yeah, in 1972, my wife made me sell $1,500 of Walmart stock. This is a $3 million lawnmower. Now, I'm quite sure it was so rusty that it couldn't even be used anymore to mow lawns. This guy had put his treasure into the lawnmower, and his heart was still in the lawnmower because of how much he'd lost. It's a sad thing that happens if we put our heart and our treasures in the wrong place. And so Christ was simply telling us, gain vested interest in things that truly matter and things that really last, where neither moth nor rust corrupt or take away, or where thieves can't break in and rob you. But he says, instead, take stock in me. Take stock in my movement. Put your heart where my heart is. Where was the heart of Jesus? The heart of Jesus has always been the local church. That's his bride. The church is the greatest place to invest. And I say that with my life, not with my words. We took all of our entire insurance settlement from Hurricane Andrew. We took multiple savings accounts and retirement accounts over the years. And we emptied everything for the sake of the local church, for the sake of the gospel. My wife and I have done that. So I'm not just telling you about it. We practice what we preach when it comes to generosity. We're all in. Now, here's what I want to say. Be very careful to hear this. I'm not asking you to do what we did. All I'm asking you to do is we're going to pass a basket later. Just your car keys will be fine. Just we have a van to take you home. No, only reason I can joke about that is this is not a fundraising message. This is not an anti-things or anti-money message. This isn't something that if we don't raise X amount of dollars by next week, we're going to shut the doors. Hey, God doesn't really need our money. He needs what it represents, which is our heart. And he wants us to have something that makes sense and something that satisfies. People say, well, I wish I had more of a heart for people far from God without Christ. Do you want to know what Jesus would say to you? If you want to have a heart for people far from God without Christ, you put your treasures in an organization and in a ministry that has a heart for people to find and follow Jesus, and suddenly your heart and your treasure will be the same. You'll start having a heart for people who are far from God and who will miss hell and go to heaven because you're making an eternal difference in their lives. So we buy up shares in God's kingdom through our generosity through the local church. This is the second key to the treasure principle. My heart always goes to where my money goes or is going. The third key to the treasure principle of giving God maximum glory and giving us maximum satisfaction. If I have a need, I plant some seeds. And this is so cool. We've seen this over a number of decades in our church where people who didn't understand the law of harvest, the law of sowing and reaping. My early days pastor, Jack Taylor, wrote a book called God's Miraculous Plan of Economy. Jesus said it like this in Luke 6, give and it will be given to you, a good measure pressed down, shaken together and running over will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. If you want a little teacup, give a little teacup offering. If you want an 18-wheeler, give an 18-wheeler. You will reap what you sow, more than you sow and later than you sow. And every farmer knows this. When he or she as a farmer, when they plant seeds, they have a decision to make. Am I going to hold on to these seeds? Am I going to eat them for myself? Am I going to hoard them in my barn? Or am I going to give them away so that they can create a crop? And if there's a corn crop, one seed can turn into 5, ears of corn, and 1,000 different kernels in that one ear of corn could be 3 or 4 or 5,000 kernels because she decided as a farmer to give it away. Whatever you put in God's hands, he can multiply, but if you hold on to it and hoard it, it's a harm to you. It's a law that works in every avenue of life. It works for a believer. It works for an unbeliever. You will reap what you sow. More than you sow and later than you sow. The law of the harvest. Paul's words on this in 2 Corinthians. Remember this. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each one of you should give what he has decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion. Why? For God loves a cheerful giver. And that word, some of you know, in the original language is the word hilaros, from which we get the word hilarious. Some pastors say you need to give until it hurts. Actually, that is not the teaching of Jesus or the Bible. You're supposed to give until it feels good, until you know it's making an eternal difference. And it does, friends. You are never more like God than when you give. For God so loved the world that he gave. And Jesus paid it all. He gave it all for me and for you. The key is, God can only multiply what we put in his hands. And what I hold on to, I've still got and I hoard, but what I give away, God multiplies. Here's my suggestion. If you have a need, start planting some seeds. Pastor, that doesn't make sense. If I have all these needs and I start planting some of my seeds, then I won't have as many needs that are being met. That's not the way it works. This is the difference between giving by reason and giving by revelation. Giving by reason reasons it out in a human way. Isaiah says, God says, my ways are not your ways. My ways are higher than your ways. So if you have a need, you go, well, I'll wait till God blesses me and I win the Mega Millions lottery, then I'll give back. No, you won't, because you're going to do exactly what you've already been doing. That's the way it works. So if you have some needs, start planting some seeds. My wife has given away so many shoes and she's gotten shoes back. I've given away golf and fishing and I've got golf and fishing back. I'm sorry, it just works that way. I didn't make it up. It's God's miraculous plan of economy. Number 4 treasure principle, and this is gonna be the last one today. I'm gonna invite you back next time for the rest. This is incredibly cool because it's for God's maximum glory and for your maximum satisfaction. Here it is. Heaven, not earth, is my true home. Remember Dorothy back in Kansas with her experience in the land of Oz? There's no place like, one more time, there's no place like, hey, the holidays are approaching and many of us know what that feels like. Man, there's no place like home. And many of us know what that feels like, but did you know, and I'm here to remind you, that's one of my chief roles. Like I'm the chief reminding officer, really. For most of you, you already know some of this, but I get to remind you and encourage you and challenge you. But how easily we forget where our home really is. If you are a follower of Jesus, when you close your eyes in this life, you don't leave home, you go home. That's your real home. Everything else, you're a pilgrim, you're just passing through. You have a little while, a little dot, a little time, and it'll vanish away. Christ's follower, the writer of Hebrews says they admitted that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they're looking for a country of their own. Instead, they were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he prepared a city for them. Paul later says, the apostle says, we prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord, 2 Corinthians 5:8. Christian friend, when we understand this world is not my home, all the stuff, as important and intriguing as that is, it will begin to lose its glitter and shine because we know we're just passing through. We're aliens on this planet. We're citizens of heaven. And if you're here today and you're not yet a follower of Jesus Christ, heaven is not yet your eternal home. The good news is, if that's you today, when we're done today, I'll be out in the lobby in the hallway. And if you don't know that you know that you know that heaven is your home, I can help you make absolute certain of that before you leave today. Come see me. But I'm here to remind every one of you who are followers of Jesus, those of us who have worshiped today, those of us who have gathered in groups throughout the week, whether men up groups or women's groups or just groups, that you're not home yet. God's not done with you. And the world is not your home. It's not. I'm passing through and it's all on loan from God anyway. So I want to close with a story, an analogy. told by John Ortberg, used by James Dobson. This is about 15, 20 years ago. How many of you, before I share the story, have ever played the game? I want to see your hands. Monopoly. Man, yeah, almost everybody. Get it into your mind. She was a lovely woman who lived in their house for many years. But this genteel old woman was also the most ruthless Monopoly player you had ever seen. Imagine what would have happened if Donald Trump had married Leona Helmsley and they would have had a child. Then you have some picture of what my grandmother was like when she played Monopoly. She understood that the name of the game is to acquire, acquire, acquire. He said that when he played her as a kid, he would love to hold on to his money because it was just fun to have money and touch it. But Grandma bought up everything she landed on and mortgaged as much as she could possibly buy up to accumulate everything she possibly could, and eventually she became the master of the board. And every time he landed, he would have to pay her money. And eventually, every time she would take my last dollar, I would quit in utter defeat. And then she would always say the same thing to me. She'd look at me and say, one day, you'll learn to play the game. Well, one summer when he was a little older, he played Monopoly with a neighbor, a kid, a friend of his. Almost every day, all day long, they'd play Monopoly for hours and hours. And that summer, he learned to play the game. He finally figured out that the only way to win is to make a total commitment to acquisition. I came to understand that money and possessions, that's the way you keep score. And by the end of that summer, I was more ruthless than my grandmother. I was ready to bend the rules if I had to win that game. Fall came, and wiser, more cunning, he sat down to challenge his grandma in a game of Monopoly. Slowly, cunningly, I exposed my grandma's vulnerability. Relentlessly, inexorably, he drove her off the board. He said, "The game does strange things to you. I can still remember it. It happened at Marvin Gardens." I looked at my grandma. She taught me how to play the game. She was an old lady by now. She was a widow. She'd raised my mom. She loved my mom. She loved me. And I took everything she had. I destroyed her financially and psychologically. I watched her give her last dollar and quit in utter defeat. It was the greatest moment of my life. And then she had one more thing to teach me. She said, now, John, it all goes back in the box. All those houses and hotels, all those railroads and utility companies, all that property and all that wonderful money, now, John, it all goes back in the box. But I didn't want it to go back in the box. I wanted to leave the board out forever, bronze it maybe as a memorial to my ability to play the game. No, she said. None of it was really yours in the first place. You got all excited about it for a little while, but it was around a long time before you sat down at this board, and it will be here long after you're gone. Players come and players go, but it always goes back in the box. Friends, I realize in a church like ours, in a place like Marietta Powder Springs, this is not the easiest conversation to have, to shift our perspective to God's perspective. That God wants us to store up treasures. He commands it. But to stop storing them in the wrong places and in the wrong people, to start storing them somewhere where they'll last, and it'll make more sense, and you'll be more satisfied. This is the treasure principle. How joyful generosity brings God maximum glory and brings us maximum satisfaction. See, Jesus knew there's only one thing that will last, only one thing you can actually take to heaven with you, and it's other people. So here's his recommendation. That's where your heart and your treasures ought to go. To an organization, to an entity that will take those treasures that are on earth and trade them for heavenly treasures so that we can help people miss hell and go to heaven. I can't think of a better organization to take the assets that God has gifted you with and on a regular, systematic basis, contribute as generously as you possibly could to the mission of that organization that helps people far from God find and follow the one that we have found and we follow. So I'm gonna challenge you before the holidays even get here to discover how joyful generosity can liberate you to give God maximum glory and you maximum satisfaction. All over this room, could I pray with you and for you if you'd bow your heads for just a moment? As I pray this prayer, here's what I'm gonna ask you to do. I'm gonna ask you to whisper this prayer, in effect, back to God. To talk, prayer is just talking to God and hearing his voice. Might you be willing to whisper this back to God? Father in heaven, give me an eternal perspective when it comes to my treasures, my stuff. Change the way I think about my money and my stuff. Change the way I give. Help me to lay up fewer treasures on earth and more in heaven. Help me to remember that it all belongs to you. It's all on loan. That my heart always goes where my money goes. Give me faith to plant seeds because I've got needs. And help me remember that my true home is a place called heaven. And that one day, it all goes back in the box. Thank you for that fresh reminder today that I'm never more like you than when I give. Thank you for giving me grace. Thank you for giving me your one and only Son, Jesus, in whose generous, life-giving name we pray.